everybody to the first of the British Ecological Society webinar series. I think there's about 19 or 20 of you out there listening in. The subject of today's webinar is surviving the Viva, and we're going to be focusing very much on the system as it is in the British and Irish systems, where the Viva is very much an examination of your thesis by independent examiners. And we have with us today John Finn and Billy Hunter, who are going to be giving us some insights, their particular perspectives on the Viva. From my own personal point of view, I've recently moved to the University of Amsterdam, so I'm about an hour ahead of all of you. But I was in the UK system for 9 years before that, and I've graduated a number of PhD students. And I graduated from my PhD with the University of Leicester a few years ago now. So I'm reasonably familiar with the system. It is. I think the Viva is something where you have an opportunity to show what you know in your thesis. You should be the expert on it by that point, and it's really just a chance for you to benchmark yourself against other colleagues and academics from external institutions. And I think that external validation is actually something that in the UK system is actually really nice, because when you come out of it and you get that positive feedback, hopefully, or you get that benchmarking, that it's that you can really consider yourself that you've gone through that journey, that everybody else has been through that process, and you've joined that group, which is different to certain other countries. So anyway, rather than me talking too much more than that, I'm going to hand you over to John, who's going to start off by introducing himself, I hope, a little bit, and talking about to have a good Viva, you should ... John.
Thanks, Will, and hi, everyone. I think it's great to have an opportunity to contribute here today. The PhD Viva can be seen as a very stressful event by many people, largely because it's quite difficult to know what you're walking into. So hopefully this webinar can contribute to taking some of the mystery out of the Viva. My name is John Finn. I'm an ecologist working in agricultural ecology. I'm based with a national research institute in agriculture in Ireland called Teagasc. Although I spend most of my time on research, I've had a keen interest in PhD training for several years, and I'm a PhD supervisor. I've been an external examiner in several occasions, and I'm a program director of a national agri-food graduate program that we have, which supports PhD students. So a few years ago, I also published a book called Getting a PhD, and it's the hardback copy. The paperback has a really flashy red cover. It's called Getting a PhD, an action plan to help manage your research, your supervisor, and your project. So I'm not touting for sales here, but what I am touting for is that you read it. I think there's a really good chapter there on the examination process, and a lot of what I'm going to say today comes from that. And it's got bits in there with checklists of things that you should know about the exam, examples of the examination criteria, and there's also some detailed lists of the questions that are asked. I remember one student who came up to me and said, "Oh, I really like your book. In fact, I liked it so much that I photocopied all of it." So I guess that's a good endorsement. Okay, you can also find me on Twitter at PhD Skills, and I regularly circulate information about PhD topics and stuff that's of interest to PhD students. So I think maybe first of all to start by, today I want to talk about the PhD Viva from the perspective of the external examiner. And I think the first thing to say is that there's lots of horror stories about the Viva floating around there, and just forget about them. I mean, these are the minority events, and most students pass the Viva, and most students, believe it or not, enjoy the Viva, because it's such a rare opportunity to discuss their work. It might not feel like that beforehand, but so many students come out of the Viva afterwards saying, "God, I really enjoyed that." So maybe I'll start just quickly speaking about the selection of the external examiner. I mean, who are these people that turn up at your Viva and ask you all these questions? Well, they tend to be members of staff in research who are research active, and they have some sort of independence from your project and your university. There are many rules governing the Viva and selection of the external examiners, the exam process, and you really should read up on all of these rules and ask your PhD supervisor to support you with that. Personally, I think it's really good if you know who your external examiner is. Most students will have met their external examiner or the person who is going to be their external examiner at a conference, maybe a workshop, or maybe has emailed them talking about their work together. So, and that's a really good introduction to your external examiner and a great way to break the ice. On the other hand, you may have not met your PhD external examiner, which would probably add a little bit to the unknown quantity. So it'd be a really good idea to find out who they are, what their research is, and probably to include a few of their references in your reference list. In terms of it depends a lot, but in terms of your contribution to selecting the external examiner, I don't think you actually select the external examiner. Your supervisors do that. But it probably would be a really good idea for you to be a bit more proactive and say, well, you know, sometime before the selection happens, that you maybe initiate that conversation with your supervisor and have some contribution to that if you're allowed to. The final decision will be your supervisors, but that doesn't mean that you can't express preferences or certainly know who's going to be your external examiner. That'll surely happen. So what's the purpose of the external examiner? When they they're appointed, and universities tend to give them quite broad criteria for assessing the theses and the Viva. And these kind of criteria include, I'll just read a list of them here: conceptual clarity in the research, an intellectual appreciation of the conceptual and theoretical basis of the research, a strong awareness of the limitations as well as the wider significance of the research. They're looking for a strong, coherent argument and a consistent chain of logic that prevails throughout the whole thesis. Appropriate engagement with the literature, properly interpreting the literature, and also citing the most relevant and up-to-date literature. One of the key things that external examiners look for is the student's grasp of methodology and ensuring that the linkage between the stated objectives, the methods that are chosen, the way they're implemented, the way that the analysis is done, and the conclusions, that these are valid and robust. And that's a key role of the external examiner. They're also checking to make sure that the thesis is presented in accordance with the university's guidelines. And it's one of the more minor activities, but it's extremely important from the university's point of view to ensure that consistency of presentation. Another really important part of the external examiner's job is to ensure that there's originality and an original contribution to knowledge made by the thesis. I discussed this actually in my book, this whole topic of originality, and you don't have to win a Nobel Prize to pass your PhD, Viva. Okay, it can be quite simple sometimes in how a student's work can make a real original contribution, and can be quite modest in many times, and maybe somebody can return to this in the questions. I think another key topic that I invite you to return to in the questions is that the thesis contains potential for publication. And I think one of the take-home messages I'd have is that, if at all possible, it makes the external examiner's job a lot easier if you have one or two publications that are either submitted or about to be accepted or have been accepted in your thesis. I'll talk about that again in a moment. So as an external examiner, I'm asked by the university, am I willing to be an external examiner? And the first thing I do is have a look at my schedule and see, is this thesis going to arrive in November, January, February? Do I have other major commitments at that time? And if I've got the time to take it on, I'll say yes, because it's actually quite a serious undertaking for an external examiner to devote what will probably be, up to 3 or 4 days of time reading and rereading the thesis. So usually what happens is that I'll get something like this will arrive in my desk and arrive in the post, and I'll be asked to, I'll pick it up, and one of the first things I'll do is I'll have a look at the abstract and the title. And I'm just checking to see, is this a topic that I'm interested in? And hopefully it is, and I'll have known that before then. I'll have a look at the introduction, and I'll be scanning through, what kind of topics, what kind of literature is here, and I'll have a look at the conclusions. And I should know quite a bit about the broad topic, even though I don't know anything about this thesis or this research. And at that point, I'll be making judgments in my own mind, saying, yeah, there's something really interesting here. There's something really original here. I can see how this is bringing on this subject area. And again, that's already influencing my judgment of the thesis. One of the other things that I'll do when I get a thesis for the first time is I'll jump to the references section, and I'll be looking at the consistency of formatting, because I think this is one of those key indicators of whether a thesis has been prepared a little bit too hastily or not. Okay, so the best of theses will have references that are all in a consistent format. There are capital letters where there should be, and there are small letters where there should be. The EndNote default formatting hasn't taken over, and the student has done what the university is asking. It's often a real good indication of the quality of the end product that the thesis is when the references are in good shape. It might seem like a small picky thing, but I have to say, time and time again, when reading journal articles or submitted manuscripts, as well as PhD theses, the quality of the references section is a pretty good indicator of whether sufficient time has been put into preparation or not. I'll be looking at the dates of the references and seeing is the literature up to date. What type of journals are being cited? Are they the proper journals? Is there a wide range of journals that is not too much focus on one journal? And I have to admit, I have a sneaky peek and see is my own work cited or not. And you really should make sure that your external examiner's work is cited in some way or other in the thesis. We're human too, and we have little egos that, we won't have objective those egos are brushed to small bit. Okay, so then I'll set time aside, maybe a day, and I'll be reading the thesis in detail. I'll have a stack of post-it notes beside me, and I'll be slapping post-it notes on most pages saying, okay, keep an eye out for this topic. How well addressed is it later on? You promised that you're going to deal with such and such an objective. It might sound overly ambitious, and I'm saying, okay, is this going to be dealt with in the way that you promised later in the thesis? I'll be making notes to myself about, work that's really praiseworthy, as well as work, and I'll be ready to praise that in the Viva, as well as anywhere I think that, okay, I need some more clarification on these methods. I don't quite understand what's going on here. I don't think that these conclusions are fully justified, or they just go a little bit further than is justified by the data analysis. I'll be making little notes like that to myself on the first reading, which could be a little bit quick. Then, having gone through the whole thesis, I'll go through it in detail at least 2 more times, probably, and I'll be checking to see, are my initial criticisms justified? Because the criticism that I have on page 26 may well be addressed by the time that I get to page 100. So I'm all the time channeling down to see what are the most important criticisms that I have of this thesis, but also the most important strong features of this thesis that I would like the student to also be aware of in the Viva. Like I said, the reading of the thesis, it's a big investment of time and effort by me and every external examiner. So it's also a very important stage. After reading the thesis, most universities will ask for some sort of an interim report, which says, can you please, as an external examiner, I'm asked to confirm this work is of sufficient quality to go ahead to the Viva. And also it's of sufficient quality to meet the broad criteria. So it's not a formal assessment, but it's certainly an interim assessment. And that leads me to probably the single biggest take-home message that I would have for today, which is that the examiner's reading of the thesis that happens before the Viva is probably the main focus of assessment. Now, people get really hung up on the Viva, and that this is the period when they're going to be assessed and their work is going to be assessed. And yes, that does happen to a certain extent. But if I'm after spending 3 or 4 days reading a thesis without any Viva happening, I'm after writing an interim report without any Viva happening, it's quite clear and logical that I'm already after forming really, really strong impressions about whether I think this work is meeting the university guidelines, whether it's meeting the standards that we expect of a thesis and of doctoral research or not. So again, this is my take-home message. As an external examiner, I'm already making really strong judgments about your work based on the thesis and before the Viva. And there's a lot of research supporting the fact that most examiners don't change their opinion of the thesis that is formed before the Viva. So we go to the Viva and it more or less confirms what we suspect from the thesis. And I think if examiners do change their mind, it's quite minor, and very often it brings a borderline thesis up into the pass category, and certainly more so than the other way around. So again, I can't say it strongly enough. Make sure that your thesis that you submit is submitted to the highest possible standard, because that first impression that you leave on the examiner is extremely important. Okay, so the main purpose of the Viva then is to ensure that this is the student's own work, that the PhD candidate is capable of explaining and justifying the research, and also something that's not maybe so appreciated by students is that this is an opportunity for a mature and a detailed academic discussion between two scholars, essentially, one of whom is acting as for the external examiner, almost acting as a gatekeeper into the scholarly community, and then this other person who is proving that they are worthy of entering the scholarly community as a doctoral candidate. So on the day of the Viva, I'll bring along the thesis. It'll be littered with post-it notes, usually. I'll also have a short list of key questions that I want to ask the student, and they'll be prioritized. If I have enough time, I might get to some of the lower priority questions, but I'll have a number, at least 10 to 20 questions that are talking in general about the thesis, but maybe also specific questions about, I don't agree with your interpretation of this figure, or I think your data could have been analysed in this other way. What do you think? And I'll be very much pushing it over the candidate to justify their approach and possibly concede that it could have been done better. A feature of the modern Viva, and certainly changed since I did mine way back around 1998, is that the students get an opportunity to make a PhD presentation, just a short, 15 minutes about their presentation. And I would really support that. I think it puts the student in a really strong position to start the Viva with them being in control. And provided that you've practiced and have a really good presentation, you can make a really strong impression on the external examiner. Keep in mind that the examiner has spent a lot of time reading the detail of your thesis. So in that presentation, I think you should really focus on the big issues. So you're presenting the main results, you're really discussing what contribution to knowledge that you've been making, where is the originality in your thesis, and the implications of your work for your discipline. So we're not really worried about, how many replicates you did in this, that, or the other. Really, it's talking about the bigger issues. I've been in a couple of Vivas where I've read the thesis beforehand and been not so sure about the kind of contraptions that we ecologists design so often to, customized contraptions for mesocolumn designs, for sampling designs and things like this. The use of pictures in that presentation and in the thesis, by the way, is a really useful way of conveying what words struggle to do so many times. That presentation is also an opportunity to do something that you don't get an opportunity to do in the thesis, which is maybe talk about some of the outreach that you've undertaken, conference presentations, whether you've been active on social media and talking about your work, radio interviews, media engagement, as well as papers that you might have had accepted in the interim between the examiner receiving the thesis and actually getting to the day of the Viva. So I guess most people are concerned about what kind of questions am I going to be asked in during the Viva. So there's some really great resources out there on the internet and in various blogs by a number of people who are supporting these kind of topics. I really like a bunch of questions that Patrick Dunleavy has, and he tackles a number of topics, and I fully agree with these as the kind of questions that come up in the Viva. So, for example, he talks about the impact and the originality of the work. And these are questions like, where is the originality in your thesis? What things in the thesis would you say are your own? I heard of a question asked by a PhD examiner as the first question in a Viva, which is a tough start, but he said, okay, this is a beautiful thesis, there's great research in here. Okay, now that's a good start. But he said, which of these ideas are those of your supervisor and which ideas are yours? So that's a really good question to be prepared for in general, because it's a real good probing into your critical analysis, your ability to have taken original ideas that were inevitably informed by your supervisor, but also to make them your own, and be prepared to demonstrate that on the day. How the research came to be is a very important thing. So how did you choose to do this topic? Where did the ideas come from? How did the final topic differ from that which was originally intended? What are some of the difficulties that were encountered? Excuse me. How did you decide on which questions were within the scope and which questions were outside of scope? I think in ecology Vivas, one of the key areas of discussion are the methods and the methodology that's chosen. So, for example, what you'll be asked, what are the core methods that are used in your thesis? Why did you choose this approach? What approaches did you consider but not take on? And a favorite question of my own is something like, in hindsight, what would you have done differently? And this is a wonderful test of your critical analysis, because it allows you the opportunity to critique your own work and to say, well, yeah, I had 4 treatments, and in hindsight, I should have focused on extending them to 5 or 6, to test the ends of a regression line, for example. Or you should have had more replication, you wished you had done a power analysis beforehand, whatever. It's an opportunity for you to show that you're able to critique your own work, but then to say, and if I could have done it differently, here's what I would do, which is to show that you're well aware of how to do it correctly, and if you had sufficient resources or logistics or money, that you would have been able to do it properly or better. So those methodological approaches are really important, and we ask students all the time things like, why did you choose to do a field experiment? Why not a glasshouse experiment? Why not a pot experiment? If you did a pot experiment, why was the pot this size? What do you think of the limitations of using a pot experiment over a field scale experiment? All of these kind of questions. And so on, and there's lots of discussion about data, which you'd probably be expecting. And things like, well, how confident are you that these data support your conclusions? You make this conclusion in your concluding section, and they might state what the conclusion is. Where's the data to support this conclusion? So these are tough questions, but you got to be ready for them, and they're also fair questions. This is testing your ability to be a doctorate level candidate. I'll provide some of these, Samina will provide some of these resources on the BES website afterwards, but that gives a flavour of the kind of questions that happen in the PhD Viva. I think people are often quite shocked at how high level these questions are. I mean, nobody's asking you things like, well, okay, they can ask you things like, talk me through figure 4 in chapter 2, and they may be testing a particular interpretation. But many of the questions are much bigger picture than that, and they're talking about things like, describe the strengths and weaknesses of your research. Can you justify why you chose this research topic? How have you advanced this topic through your research? These are bigger picture questions, and they're not really saying, go to page 20 and I want to talk to you about this, although that will happen as well. Okay, so just as before I sign off, maybe a couple of do's and don'ts that I've just jotted down here. I think, again, my take-home message is to remember that although the Viva is a very emotionally engaging experience and really attracts the attention, it's the thesis that's the main focus of assessment, and really don't submit as strong a thesis as you possibly can. I came across a blog recently, and the title of the blog was, or the outcome of it was, don't print, bind, and submit your thesis in the same day. Okay, so it really suggests that some students leave it all to the last minute, and this won't be good for the quality of your final thesis. Get used to talking about your research. Don't just present your research, but talk about your research. And this is great practice for the Viva, to be able to put into words the kind of things that you're so well at saying on paper. Bring an annotated copy of your thesis. Okay, you make sure you have a copy of the thesis that is covered in post-it notes that you want to deal with things, or where you think that priority issues might arise. Take time to respond to the questions. I think there's nothing wrong with taking 5 to 10 seconds. It might seem like an awkward silence, but you're perfectly entitled to gather your thoughts and take time to formulate a proper response, and even to take a moment to read that page in the thesis if it's relevant. Be prepared to defend your work, and eat something before you go in. I think every Viva that I've come out of and spoke to the student afterwards, they just talk about how hungry they are afterwards, having not had a breakfast or not having had a lunch. So anyway, it's a small thing, but it's easy to tackle. So don't submit a substandard thesis. Don't be defensive if there are legitimate criticisms of your work. If you can see that the examiner has a good point here, that I didn't use enough replicates, my treatments probably weren't implemented properly, be prepared to concede the point and acknowledge that yes, it could have been done better. Okay, it's not the end of the world, and I'm sure that there are other parts in your thesis where you've done perfectly good work. And when you have done good work, be prepared to defend that strongly. But if there are legitimate criticisms, concede them, and don't become argumentative or let things get heated. Okay, that's a bad thing. Don't pretend to know the answers. Billy might cover this shortly, so I'll leave him to deal with that. And I think you should take a lot of confidence from the fact that no matter how many times the external examiner has read your thesis, you know the work better than they do. Okay, so take confidence from that, and don't forget that. And finally, it might sound like weird advice, but I think you should look forward to the Viva. It's rare that anything bad happens in the Viva, and the vast majority of students come out of it saying, "Wow, I really enjoyed that." And it's because it's one of those really rare opportunities where people sit down and your thesis is the focus of discussion for an hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe 3.5 hours, and you've got experts willing to talk about your work only, and this may never again happen in your career. So that's why people enjoy it. It's the work that you've spent 3 years working on, and for a few hours you get a couple of experts talking about that work and nothing else. And that can be a really rewarding scholarly activity, which is one of the main purposes of the Viva. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John. That was really excellent. Yeah, the Viva as an enjoyable process. So I'm sure everybody out there is now really looking forward to their Viva, and we're going to move on to our second speaker, Billy Hunter, who's going to talk a little bit, maybe not quite such a positive title here, but surviving the Viva. Sounds like it might be a bit of a trial, but surviving that enjoyable experience. Okay, Billy, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Will. So I guess just a bit of background. So I relatively recently completed my PhD back in 2012 at the University of Aberdeen. And since then I've been working as a postdoc in Austria, and now I'm back to Belfast in Northern Ireland to work as a postdoc on a new project here. So I'm only here for about a month now and still settling in. Thinking back to my Viva, the run up to it is one of the most stressful experiences that I think I've had. I think it's only matched by the experience I had running up to a NERC fellowship interview in terms of pressure. But obviously they both amount to the same thing, which is what they determine sort of to a large extent what your future job prospects are, etc. So they're quite high pressure situations. Just to kind of give you a rough idea in terms of what to expect with your Viva, I think that I did a little bit of a random sample of various recent early career researchers and recent PhDs. The mean Viva time seems to fall in around 3 hours, at least for my very small group. But there's quite a range of times there. There's people that have had Vivas that have run up to about 5 to 6 hours, to be honest. And likewise, there's people that go in and are out 2 hours later. So there seems to be quite a variance in that. Personally, mine was about 4 hours, and it didn't feel like 4 hours when you're in the room. It feels somewhere closer to 20 minutes. With regard to what that actually involves, the first 5 minutes you tend to feel quite stressed out. That's the first 5 minutes are really just you sort of getting to grips with where you are, and normally the examiners are fairly understanding to that fact. So the first questions that they tend to ask you tend to be a little bit of general stuff about your own research, your research interests, and what your future plans are with regard to your research, and what you hope to do, what you hope to do to sort of progress from your Viva, and then they tend to, after that point, lead you into the discussion, and it is more a discussion than a series of questions, at least in the experience that I had, and the experience that all of the other folk that I've spoke to recently about it has been. So really the key there is to engage in the discussion. As John sort of highlighted, by saying that you should enjoy the Viva, whilst it's not necessarily enjoyable, you should at least try to show your enthusiasm for your subject. I mean, after all, this is the thing that you've chosen to work on for the past three and a half years. I mean, the average PhD lasts about 3.9 years, apparently. So, that's a significant portion of your life recently that you've devoted to this subject. So really try to show some of the passion that drove you into research, into doing that work in the first place. From that point of view, in terms of the discussion, I think it's a good idea if you try as much as possible to lead the discussion. So it's a good idea for you to sort of highlight the areas that you think there are strengths in your thesis. Also highlight the areas that you recognize as being weaknesses, and explain why you've made decisions. Because every piece of work that you do is a compromise, and no experiment, no study can ever be perfectly designed. So it's perfectly reasonable for you to make those statements. It's perfectly reasonable for you to make a statement, recognize the weaknesses, and explain those to the examiner. And that in that way, you can kind of head off any really nasty questions that you're likely to run into. With regard to the examiners, the external examiner is really kind of the gatekeeper to your entrance into this scholarly community. It's important to remember that the internal examiner is essentially there as a referee. So they're kind of there to ensure that that the external gives you a fair hearing, and they're also there to make sure that you don't somehow trample over the external examiner, although I'm not sure how that would be possible when you're the one under examination. With that in mind, I mean, the internal examiner tends to ask questions, but they'll tend to not to be the one to lead the interrogation. That tends to be the external. Although it depends. Some people can be unfortunate, and some people can get very vigorous internal examiners who are much more who don't tend to follow the mold. So it is by convention that they're sort of the referee. It's not a hard and fast rule. Regarding that, you need to check regarding your own individual universities have their own rules and regulations regarding independent observers. It is possible sometimes if you want to have someone in that's as an independent observer, but bear in mind, it's your work, and ultimately you're the best advocate for your own work. So provided you're well prepared, there's no reason that the examiners have to fail you. They have no interest in that. So there shouldn't be any definite need for any sort of an independent observer in that respect. And then I guess the final thing is, in the first instance, in terms of what they expect with the results, 7 out of 10 people, according to the official statistics, pass with minor corrections. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's ever passed without any corrections. But likewise, I've never actually met anyone that's failed, although it is possible to fail. And the key there is to prepare your thesis, produce a strong thesis, and also be prepared on when you go into the Viva. So in terms of that preparation, just type up my notes. There's the key there is really the preparation that you do beforehand. So you write your thesis. Don't do this in a rush. Don't spend significant periods of time procrastinating during that time. You just have to focus, and likewise make sure that it's well proofread. Don't just rely on your supervisor to proofread your thesis. It's a really good idea to get someone that's not even necessarily a scientist, someone who's completely disconnected from the project to proofread it, because one, it needs to be intelligible, not necessarily to a general audience, but it needs to be intelligible to a scientist. It also needs to read in proper English. And I actually found that letting my wife, who's a teacher, proofread it was probably the best thing I've ever done, because a teacher's an expert with a red pen. So obviously, in that respect, having the well-prepared thesis is a really important thing. Similarly, familiarize yourself with your own research. Make sure that you've read your thesis, read any papers that you've produced from your thesis, and familiarize yourself with those. And as John had previously alluded to, it's a good idea to try to get some papers published from your thesis in advance of your Viva. The other strength that this has is that when you go through the peer review process, you get the reviewers' comments back on those papers, which are essentially parts of the thesis, and that gives you a good basis for a list of questions that you can anticipate the examiner's probably going to ask you. So I would say, if you can get papers ready to publish, get them out. They don't have to go into Nature or Ecology Letters. They just need to go to a reasonably robust journal, which will give a good review. So putting things into any of the ecology literature really is a good starting point. With that in mind as well, you really need to familiarize yourself with the current state of knowledge in the field and also in the associated fields. So as an ecologist, you need to be keeping up with the literature, constantly reading papers, thinking about papers. So don't give up on things when you're going through that writing up process. Don't give up on doing things like being involved with the likes of departmental journal clubs, where you get this chance to discuss papers. I think that's a really important thing, and I think that would be my one key point. My big take-home message is to read broadly around the subject, because there's likely to be a key paper that comes out within a week of your thesis that directly relates to the work that you've been doing, and when that happens, the examiner is going to pick up on that paper and ask how that links into the work you've been doing. Viva preparation. It's a good idea that if there's any courses on Viva preparation, it's a good idea to kind of take advantage of those, because the universities tend to organise these things, and they bring in people that have experience in doing that. Likewise, if you can organize a mock Viva, I'd say it's actually, I never did it, but I can see a real strength in having a chance to sit down and have a couple of academics from your department address some of the questions within your thesis, because it's again another way for you to be able to anticipate what the examiners are likely to ask you. With that in mind, most people now have a good relationship with their supervisor by the end of their PhD. I say most people. Some people tend to have reached a point where they no longer speak with their supervisor, but it's a good idea to maintain that relationship, and also to take an active role in choosing your external examiner. As John said, you may well know your external examiner. Typically in ecology, the specific fields tend to be quite small, so it's inevitable that you're going to run into them at a conference. You may have worked with them, well, not worked directly with them, but worked on similar projects to them, so there's always that interaction. And it's a good idea to sort of familiarize yourself with their research, as has previously been sort of said. And in the last few days beforehand, the key is, take a bit of a rest. Step away from your thesis for a bit. Don't spend the last day with your nose burrowed into your thesis trying to memorize things or trying to construct the best arguments, because you need to go in there as fresh as possible. So I would say the last day, go and do something else. Go and watch a movie, go bungee jumping. It doesn't really matter as long as you're away from your thesis. Perhaps bungee jumping is not the best option. You also want to be able to walk in uninjured. And when you're there, I know this is a really basic, simple thing, but I've heard of too many people that haven't remembered to bring their own copy of the thesis with them. I mean, it's key that you bring an annotated copy, because the last thing you want to do is be working from a PDF on your laptop or something, and where you're having to scroll back and forward, and you haven't got your own notes there. It's also a good idea, construct a list of questions that you want to ask the examiners. Things that you want to know about, particularly about the external examiner's research, because there's a good chance for you to sort of build a potential collaborations for the future. I mean, the way that so many jobs seem to appear in science is that people very quickly get earmarked for a post because of who they know and how they've presented work at conferences, etc. And so I mean, it's a really good stepping stone for you to kind of raise your own profile, and also to sort of build a new professional relationship that you perhaps didn't have when you were working in your PhD. Because as a postdoc, the key is to build collaborations and establish yourself as sort of independent of your PI. And the last thing, sort of with regard to what's going on within your Viva, is when you're answering the questions, remember that you want to step away from the main detail of the question. Try to address the broader concepts. Think about the overarching concepts, and then return to the details. So you're setting your thesis and the different topics within your thesis into the wider scientific context. And then, I guess that's sort of the fundamentals. The things I wish I'd known when I was going in, there's a few. Obviously, the first one is that there's no real common standard for how a Viva is conducted in the UK. So different examiners tend to have their own particular traits, their particular quirks that they they like to discuss things. Likewise, it's your interaction with the examiner that ultimately dictates how the Viva goes. So if you can elaborate and keep the conversation going, you're less likely to then have to address things line by line within the thesis. You want to sort of build this into a discussion about the science and stay away from things that potentially where they are going to get drawn to how you state something in the text or particular issues about your experimental design. I'm not saying that you try to be dishonest. It's just a case of trying to focus on the broader picture and the bigger strengths of your thesis. It's also worth noting that in a couple of the case studies that I've managed to get over the last few days, there's examples of examiners being quite badly prepared. People have maybe arrived and basically read your thesis on the flight over. So this is both a bit of a problem at times, but it's a good opportunity for you to really lead the discussion again. As I previously said, it's a good opportunity for you to kind of signpost the things that you want them to take out of your thesis, and with that in mind, try not to panic if the first question that the examiner is essentially asking you to do is summarize your thesis in like a couple of sentences. That's a good opportunity for you.
Okay. Cheers, buddy. Shall we see if we can move on? That's really interesting because actually my internal examiner was on his way back from a long haul flight, had read the thesis on the flight over, and then actually managed to fall asleep during my Viva. Which was quite something. So yeah, he did wake up and apologize, but you do get a variety of preparedness, I think. Thankfully, my external examiner was very much on the ball, and we sort of looked at each other and nodded and just continued, which was kind of interesting. So I think that was a really great insight into how things went. And some top tips on surviving the Viva. So if I could just sort of summarize a little bit the two talks or two sets of input we've had. I mean, I think the key thing that's come out for me is, one, write a good thesis, and that message that you're examined on your PhD that you have submitted primarily. Although there is an influence from the Viva, I think that's a really important thing to remember, and maybe that takes a bit of the pressure off the Viva, which is an emotionally charged event. And also, I think the other key thing that I've written down here is that to make sure that you're submitting something that is up to the standard. Read other people's thesis who submitted stuff from your department that's been successful. Who are the people 1 or 2 years above you who've come out of their Viva being really happy? What have they done? What have their PhD thesis looked like? Get the copy, have a look at it. And I think the other thing is just to have that, as Billy was just saying there, about having that broad background, understanding your subject, what's the wider context. Do make sure you have some knowledge of what the external examiner is doing. You don't have to know all their methodologies and all their papers, but you probably cover their main field of interest in your introduction. You ought to be able to talk about the things that they're interested in. Hopefully, that's the reason you selected them, or they were selected to come and do your Viva, is that they have some link with your research. So I think that sort of summarizes up a little bit. In terms of questions, we've had a number of questions beforehand, and there's a few come through. So I'm just going to throw these out to Billy and John. And I know some of you have been answering these on the typing feed. I nearly said Twitter feed. It's not quite a Twitter feed, is it? But oh, my picture seems to have gone slightly crazy. that's a bit weird. Hopefully you can still hear me. There we go. And okay, so I think we've covered questions about what to bring to the Viva. Yes, do bring your thesis. Do bring some notes on that. And there's a lot of stuff here about particular preparations for the Viva. One question that came in, interesting one, I think it was from Sean Kelly on the feed, was, I was like, if you get these questions about what would you do next in this field, how do you deal with that if you're then going to move on to a different field? You've actually decided, I want to go and do something completely different now. I mean, is that would you consider that to be a valid answer, John or Billy? I mean, what if you're not going to continue with this sort of research? What's the response to those sorts of questions?
I'll go first, if that's okay.
Yep.
Okay. I think as an examiner, if I'm asking a question like that, there may be two reasons. The lesser reason is that I'm genuinely interested about where this candidate is going, what's their employment prospects. Having invested so much time in reading their thesis and meeting them face to face, you actually do have quite a personal link with the person, and you would be genuinely interested to know whether they're going to be unemployed, or do they want to continue in research, or go into into industry or something like that. So that's probably the lesser. That's maybe one of the final questions in the Viva, where you're just genuinely interested in what their plans are. On the flip side of it, the question is aimed at, okay, you've done this. And you probably should treat the question like this. You've done this piece of research for 3 years, and obviously research is never finished. I mean, every research paper or every research talk says more research is needed. And what we're really trying to get at is, what are your insights into where the priorities lie for the next bunch of researchers who want to work in this field? So you could say, well, I have other plans and I don't see myself working in this field, but I think the priorities for this area are. So, and again, that's about the insight that you bring, that critical analysis, that ability to judge the state of the art in your area and see where the gaps are and the gaps of knowledge and know how they might be addressed. So that would be the more examination side of answering that question.
I would agree with John, particularly with regard to showing that you have that you have some insight in where the future research direction should go. It's perfectly fine to be honest about your own desires with regard to your career. I think that's fine. It's also a good idea to kind of maybe mention what you're taking out of the work that you've done that can be applied elsewhere. I mean, the fact that you're learning particular analytical techniques or ways to handle data, are applicable across other fields and other directions. I mean, there's plenty of very good ecologists working for Morgan Stanley and companies like this, and they're employed because of their abilities with working with complex data sets. So that's an important thing to really sort of take on, just to sort of highlight your own sort of what you.
I guess it's about where your research has got to and where you see that trajectory. It doesn't necessarily have to be personal to what you actually want to do, and that's the sort of vision of getting to that doctoral level, if you like. You've got to be able to see that sort of red line from where you started your thesis. Why have you got there? That's what you're doing, your rationale and your justification. This is what you did about it. This is your thesis, and then this is the trajectory off into the future. So you're drawing that red line from the question that you had to start with. Why is that question a valid one? To that point where you've got it now, and what's the next steps?
Well,
yeah. Sorry. Yep.
Well, just returning to that point, I mean, I know one examiner who finished the exams, and he made it clear that it wasn't the most critical question of the exam or of the Viva, and he said, if I give you €1 million in the morning, sorry, it'd be pounds to all of you. If I gave you £1 million in the morning, what research would you prioritize in this area? And it's getting at the same kind of question. You know, it's tackling your vision and your critical analysis of what the gaps in knowledge are.
No, absolutely. And that sort of brings us on to the another question, which a number of people have raised, is what if you get a question in your Viva that you genuinely don't know the answer to? What extent do you deal with that? I guess that's one of the big fears as you're going in. It's like, what if they ask me something I don't know? What do you think?
I'll start with this. I guess the first thing is don't try to bluff them. But the thing is that you do know something. You know, you talk about you can still talk about the things that you do know. Use the information that you have, the knowledge you had to, and then propose. You know, we're scientists, so it's possible to make an educated hypothesis based on what information you've got but acknowledge that you are doing a bit of arm waving when you're doing this. Just don't say, "Oh, I don't know," and close yourself off.
John?
Yeah, I'd agree entirely. I mean, if it's a very basic question, of course, that's bad news, but it's likely to be a quite complex, advanced question. And as an examiner, you find when you've got a really good student, you want to push them to the point where they say, I don't know. I mean, you want to find out how good are they? And, you know, at some point, you get a real good feel of how good they are by when they say, well, you know, this really incredibly difficult question that you've just asked me, I don't know that. And it's also then incredibly impressive when they say, but I would speculate on the basis of this evidence. I believe that, you know, it's likely to be X, Y, Z. You know, that's really, really impressive. And it kind of depends on the nature of the question, but I'm assuming it's one of those really tricky, complex questions, and you just simply don't know. I mean, standard ways of dealing with questions that you're unsure of, which is a little bit different to questions that you don't know, is to ask the examiner to say it again, and they'll usually rephrase it. And maybe paraphrase the question and speak it back to them to make sure that you understood it right. Or if it's the question that you don't know, say, I think you're talking about this, this, and this. Is that right? And that actually might prompt them to talk a little bit more about what they're looking for. And ultimately, don't bluff.
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
that approach also buys you a little bit of thinking time, which is often incredibly useful. Keep the dialogue going.
Yeah,
and I think I would agree is those sorts of questions where you get a little bit stumped. It's either because you're panicking and you do know the answer, but your brain isn't quite keeping up, or they're a very technical question. So why haven't you applied statistical technique X, Y, and Z that so and so did in 1952? And at that point, really, it's sort of a little bit unreasonable to expect you to know that. Or it might be, I heard of a case recently where it was really, so what's their applicability to this field? And it was a very much a sideways leap from the main focus of the study, and the examiner was going, right, but take it over here. And that's the point where you've got to think a little bit outside the box and think on your feet. And that's when the examiner is really starting to push you. And that probably means the examiner thinks you're good. And they're prepared to give you a bit of a push. So if they're starting to ask you the really difficult questions, you're probably doing okay. Keep that in mind as well.
Will, do you mind if I return to a comment that's in the text there about reading other theses and what you said yourself in the wrap up? I think it's incredibly important, and it's quite amazing how few students read other theses. And I remember advising some of my own PhD students to read other theses from not just our department, but from other departments. And you know, it was an incredibly reassuring experience for them to see that some of these people that they would have known, they would have been PhD candidates a year or two before them. It gave them a sense that, yeah, this is a really achievable standard. And that's so important. And also that, again, it doesn't have to be that Nobel Prize standard that gets you over the line with your thesis. Another interesting feature of that is this topic that I mentioned earlier about publication, and maybe Billy and I mentioned how important it is, and how much the external examiner's job is made easy and almost is a fait accompli if you've got 2 or 3 publications. Even one of them is really, really reassuring. It just ticks that publication or potentially publishable box straight away. But one of the other interesting things that people can do is look at some of the maybe get advice from your supervisor, but look at some of the previous PhD theses and look at chapter 3 and look at the PhD version and then look at the journal article version of what that chapter eventually became. And that's a really nice example. You'll see that they can they have a similarity of about 70%. You know, if you look at if you're to do a community similarity analysis on the text, they're not the same thing, and that's quite reassuring as well to see, well, the thing that's in my thesis may not be perfect for a journal article, but it's still publishable, and I can see how these other, you know, somewhat imperfect chapters became perfect journal articles.
Cool. Okay. Thank you. Next question, which has just come in from Beth on the text feed. There is, if you've been working on your project and there's been a big change of direction, or you've had some significant problems within your thesis, how do you deal with that? How would that be put forward, or is that just seen as an excuse, as she says there, I think? But could you be criticised for that? I mean, how do you deal with that?
Do you want me to deal with that first?
Yeah, sure.
I can see you really anxious to deal with that question quickly, Billy. This is a tricky one. I haven't had to deal with it myself personally, and it depends on the nature of a major disruption. I mean, I know one of our, I bet I'm not implying this at all, but I know one of my own students would say a major disruption is pregnancy. So the student has to take 6 months maternity leave. So that's maybe slightly different, which is a stop for 6 months and then everything resumes once you start again, and that's okay. A major disruption where the project had to change because of lack of data. It depends on what happened. I mean, there are still things that can be learned from a bad experience, and that might be one way to look at it. And if it's a 3-year PhD and a year and a half of that has been completely taken up with this false start or this cul-de-sac or something that ended up being a cul-de-sac, it's hard to chuck it out completely, and I'd be tempted to include it as a learning experience and saying, this is what I did, this is how it failed, this is what I learned from it, this is my critical analysis. You know, it's back to that Thomas Edison thing that he knows, you know, 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb.
I mean, I think it's
well, you know,
yeah, I was going to say, I think it's about.
It's hard to dismiss that effort completely. Sorry, well, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're entirely right. I think it's about demonstrating that trajectory of your development as a scientist. A PhD is essentially training you to be an academic, and as an academic, every project we set up doesn't always work. So it's about demonstrating that direction and that development of you, what you can learn from it. Obviously, in each individual case is different. But yeah, there's probably something you can get out of there, even if it's a chapter early on saying, I did this, it didn't work. Billy, do you have any to add?
Yeah, I actually have quite a bit of experience with this because it sums up a lot of what happened during my own PhD. Even when things do go wrong, though, quite often you can still find there's interesting data that you can extract from a disastrous experiment. Either in terms of writing it up as a learning experience. I mean, you can kind of filter these and perhaps think about it in a method development type way. So write it as if it's a methods paper. Likewise, sometimes, you know, you don't get the data that you want. Certainly, my experimental design in my first set of experiments was completely altered by forces outside of my control, and which was essentially the Indian Navy and the US Navy decided to conduct anti-submarine warfare exercises in my in my experimental area, and I got chased out of it.
Sorry.
I was on a research cruise at the time, and we were chased away from the area we were working. But it creates but it creates a new opportunity in that you're able to work in it. I was able to do some work in a new area, and we were able to kind of rethink how the experiments we were doing and how we could use the small amount of data we got from one area with this other set of data. So it's a case of, one part of that is thinking creatively about your data. Take a look at it. Take a look at what you can extract from it. You don't have to have you don't always have to have really a really sort of perfectly designed experiment to be able to interpret something.
Come back there and said, well, what if there are no outcomes at all? Well, you obviously designed something, you obviously set something up. So as Billy was just saying, in terms of a methods idea, there was obviously something there that you set up, even if it didn't work. What did you learn from that? Why didn't it work? So I guess the answer to that question is don't focus on the outcomes. Focus on what you did do, what you did achieve, and take out of that, even if there was no actual science that came out was the problem. Okay, I think we've got about 5-10 minutes left on this, so I'd just like to see if we can cover some more general questions about, because we've quite a few about how would you start choosing or begin to approach your external examiners. I mean, from my point of view, I think that's usually done. I can deal with that one reasonably quickly. Is that's usually done, in my experience, a discussion between the PhD student and the supervisors will then usually come up with someone that they think is a reasonable candidate, or one or two people that you think is reasonable, and then they will be nominated to the university. Then you usually have to get the other people to agree, and then there's usually a university approval procedure to go through to actually get those people appointed. So as a PhD student, I was involved and have always involved my students in that discussion about who we should approach, who do we think is a good idea. So it is worth talking to the external examiners beforehand. I mean, I think that's usually quite a mechanical process, but as an individual, you should be at least consulted in that. You should be aware of who's going to be your external examiner. Is that, I mean, guys, I guess that's your experience as well.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's a good idea to identify a couple of potential examiners, because not everybody, you have to work around people's schedules, and when you're approaching them, you need to take that into account, alongside the fact that you usually have a limited time after you submit your thesis, when the university regulations say you have to have completed your Viva. So
and you're also, because you're asking these people for a significant commitment of their time, they may not be around, they may not have the time. They may say, I can do it, but I can't do it this month, or I can do it in 2 or 3 months. I had exactly that thing. I mean, I submitted my thesis in this end of November, beginning of December, and I think I wasn't examined until the following April, basically because I was out of the country, then the examiner was out of the country, and then it just took that long to get everyone together. So then trying to remember what I'd done that distance of time later was quite challenging. So you do have to be a little bit flexible on that. But one of the other good questions that came in is, so once you've got your Viva and about the examiners, how do you go about getting feedback from the examiners in terms of, say, if you want to ask their opinion on how best to publish a paper? Would you just ask them outright like that? How about getting their opinion on that, or is that not something really to do during the examination?
John, do you want to lead with this?
I think, first of all, I agree with the point. As an external examiner, it's a big commitment when you say yes to being an external examiner and reading a thesis in this detail and giving it this amount of time. And remember, our names are on the thesis as well as external examiners, so there's quite a pressure. And things that people may not appreciate is that, much of the time, and I'm not looking for sympathy from students for the external examiner, but external examiners are under a little bit of stress and pressure at a Viva as well to make sure that everything goes well, they deal with the student fairly, and they give the student every opportunity to show how good they are. That said, sorry, coming back to the other point, which was, pardon me,
about getting feedback from examiners. So
so yeah, that leads on to, as an external examiner, I would see that as one of my roles within the Viva is actually to give the kind of feedback that I would give as if I was reviewing the paper that the student would submit. The kind of feedback that I would give would be very, very similar. So it should happen by default. But if there wasn't too much pressure for time and it was appropriate, it might be a question that we'd better maybe over lunch afterwards. Have you any advice about how I might best prepare this chapter for submission to a journal? I'd be a little bit careful about raising it within the Viva. I mean, if it was a chapter that the external examiner had some minor issues with and got thinking about a bit more and discovered they had major issues with, you don't want that happening within the Viva. And also, I'm not sure about being too proactive in asking the examiner for posing questions to the examiner. It does tend to be the other way around. So it's a topic that's more suited to a lunchtime discussion rather than within the Viva.
Billy?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's something that you have time after the Viva, usually when your supervisor and you will go out to lunch with the examiners, and there's a chance there to kind of continue discussion about things around your work, like how best to sort of prepare something for publication, and maybe which sort of journals you should be targeting your papers towards, because it's useful to get a different perspective on that than perhaps your supervisors. Because everyone has their favorite journals that they sort of use as their house journal, and it's a good idea to kind of have not put everything into the one journal, really. I think that John's covered most of that there. I mean, the other thing is it's perfectly reasonable once you've sort of completed the work. If you want to write an email to your external examiner and discuss things further via email, or I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to ask them to do.
I mean, I think it's part of this dialogue, and it's part of being able to continue that discussion. So I think John's laptop is about to give it, and I think we are about at time. So I'm gonna just about sum this up now, because that will take us to about 1:15. I mean, I think I'd like to thank John and Billy for their useful insights. I hope people out there have really had an opportunity to the insight of the other side of the Viva, someone who's recently been through it and someone who's sat and done a lot of examining. I think there's quite a lot to think about there. The material related to this webinar, including part or all of the video, rather terrifyingly, will be linked up on the Methodological Society website under the careers tab. There, we're gonna at least put some version of that up there, along with useful links to things like John's book. Although obviously not plugging sales, but just find it in your local library, and Twitter feeds. John was at PhD Skills, and his associated blog with that I've had a look at, and it's got some really useful stuff for PhD students to look at. So please do visit the BES website and look at the careers and click on some of those links, and they'll be up in the relatively near future. The next webinar is going to be on the 28th of November, and that's going to be taking us on the next career steps. So you've got through your Viva. How do you get your postdoc? Job hunting and advice. When we've got Guy Woodward, who's an experienced academic from Imperial College London, talking about that, and Charlotte Miller, who is she's just on her first postdoc. She's moved from the UK and has now got a position at the University of Oslo. So hopefully she'll be able to give us an interesting perspective on hunting for PhDs, having recently gone through that. So I hope that some of you will be able to join us for that webinar on the 28th of November. I'd also like to thank Samina back at the British Ecological Society for organizing the website, and making sure that this all flows together. I think from my point of view, it seemed to have run very nicely. Would certainly be very interested to hear any feedback from you guys out there as to how it's gone, if there's anything we could do to improve or anything else. Please do not hesitate to get in contact with us through the British Ecological Society. So thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers, guys, and thanks to all of you out there. Right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.